You know, there's so much happening in the world at this time, but unless you're a news junkie, you wouldn't have a clue what's going on. Hello, I'm Mike Bain from Christian Voice New Zealand, and in a moment, let me give you a quick summary of what's really happening and why it's important to know. Every night around 6 o'clock, it's been my habit to sit and watch the news. Frustrated by the lack of what I describe as real news on TV1, I'll often flick over to TV3 and be equally frustrated. Now, it might come as a surprise to many, but there is a lot more happening in the world than the election, the Rugby World Cup, although that is really important, and whether this really is the year for the Warriors. So, look, here are some highlights of news stories that are of interest, not just for Christians, but for everyone, as this world slowly descends into darkness. Let's start with what's happening in the Pacific. A few weeks ago, I spoke about the possibility, maybe the probability, of a war with China looking to take back Taiwan and a time frame in which they can do it. Just an update of that time, it's still before the US election, probably now during the election campaign when the country is going to be distracted. The appetite to stage war is growing, and it's no surprise that rocket man Kim Jong-un wants to be a part of Team China when war breaks out. Now, on the other side of China is Russia, currently embroiled in a war with Ukraine. A war everyone is keeping out of, but supplying as much as they can to assist. But here's the thing. Russian news reports show there's an appetite for a nuclear strike on US soil. They don't see NATO, they're seeing the United States. Television aside, Russian generals are also loud about nuclear strikes against the allies of the Ukraine. The United States has its own issues, though, in that it can no longer go broke in a war these days because it's financially broke. Today, they're just one crisis away from financial ruin, as personal debt amongst its citizens recently peaked at over $1 trillion, while the country's reserves are basically empty. A couple of months back, President Joe Biden asked the Senate to approve the Federal Reserve to print another $1 trillion to pump into an already ailing economy. It's hard to believe that the downfall of the land of the free is going to end up financially broke, unable to meet its international commitments to debt repayment. But the answer has always been war. But further south, down in Brazil, just like that, overnight it changed its entire banking system to a central digital banking system. It was goodbye cash. Bet you haven't heard about it from on our news, nor how the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has plans to move New Zealand to this system. The Middle East, always a good spot for news, and we've heard the news of the massive earthquake responsible for the thousands of lives lost in Morocco. But what about the news from Israel, where the Palestinians are now launching rockets into Israel from the West Bank, and they're targeting civilians? But then it's only Israel, isn't it? It would be news if it were the other way around. But I must ask, what's happened to all the terrorists these days? Are they on holiday? It seems like an eternity since I heard a report of a terror attack. But you know what? They're still out there. But the New Zealand media isn't about reporting news. It's only interested in its own opinion. There really is a lot happening in the world. Now, I've only highlighted some stories, but the thing is, we need to know, and the reason we need to know is because the ramifications of single events elsewhere in the world impacts our daily lives. In the past, here at Christian Voice New Zealand, we've tried to keep you abreast of the times that we're living in, and the path that world leaders are being manipulated to take, and where it leads. It's not just the big things, but the small things which happen. Sometimes it maybe just be a gunshot in a foreign land, like at the start of the last century. But the echo of that gunshot cost an estimated 40 million people their lives. You know, we need to be aware of the times that we live in, the attitudes of people, the direction these attitudes are taking us. We must decide for ourselves what is right and what is wrong. We'll be asked to make it a choice in the future. About 4 years ago, I recall at one of our presentations of When a Nation Forgets God, someone in the audience challenged me over the statement that I made that New Zealand as a nation will soon be asked to decide as to whether we back the United States or China. That question is relevant today. We're going to see changes in our country over the next few years, and like Brazil's currency system, some of it will happen overnight. We need to be aware of what's happening in a world which is both financially and morally bankrupt. Jesus told his followers to stay on the watch several times. Outside of the Garden of Gethsemane, they were awakened by soldiers who came to arrest their leader. And look how quickly the world changed from that moment on. Jesus gave us an indication of the last days and said, when you see these things happening, then the Son of Man is near. And yet these things are happening. And over the weekend, I've heard church leaders denying we're living in the end times. I tell you these things because I don't want anyone caught by surprise. I saw a couple from the Hawke's Bay recently who were affected by the rising floods as they fled. The mother carrying her infant child fell below the waterline, losing a child. They wanted to know why there hadn't been sufficient warning, and yet the indicators were there. But I ask, and I've continually asked, why? Why is it that we need to be repeatedly told something is going to happen? People were not 6 years old being told by parents that if you continue down a path, there's going to be consequences. Now, I know many people no longer believe in God anymore, which doesn't surprise me. But do you know what? You may not believe anymore, but ask yourself why. Why is it that many people over the centuries have been prepared to go as far as death in their belief that God exists? Ask yourself, what if God does exist and these people were right? What if the end is near? What if you see sudden destruction happening? Why is it you'll cry out to God for help? It's because deep down you do believe God exists, and you know what? You're crying out for God, but despite the churches you turned into cafes or bars, despite people knocking at your door, despite all the warnings that you've received, you'll be crying out to a God you refuse to believe in, who was there, always for you, with his arms wide open, ready to accept you and show his love. Keep on the watch. Be aware of the times we live in. Do not ignore the warnings. We've had many examples in modern times of what happens when you remain ignorant of the times that we live in. Put yourselves into the shoes of an American in Vietnam at the end of the US occupation in 1973. You heard that the last flight out of Saigon was on March 29, but, you just didn't know the time. Would you delay being at the airport or make sure that you were the first at the airport? So it will be on the day the Son of Man, the King of Kings, comes back to earth. The signs are there. Keep on the watch. Like the last flight out of Saigon, no one knows the time when Jesus will return. So be aware of the times, the signs, and the love you can experience of knowing Jesus today. It's not too late if you act right now.